All right, perfect, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for having me here. I want to come here to talk today a little bit about what we're working on and kind of what we're focusing on at Ion Protocol, which effectively started as a project to kind of figure out how we can scale the capital allocation solution or problem when it comes to bringing in capital to EigenLayer and kind of understanding AVS kind of risk space, and then also understanding how we can actually kind of mitigate the opportunity cost for restakers when it comes to opportunities in the greater DeFi ecosystem. So right now, when we think about capital allocation within EigenLayer, I personally believe that when it comes to actually scaling, getting people in the door when it comes to restaking, we're really not at that point yet. And one of the main reasons there is kind of one of the biggest unsaid questions about kind of EigenLayer that a lot of infrastructure-focused folks don't really want to ask, which is realistically, how can we see the translation of AVS revenue to actual returns for restakers? And especially when we look, we had that LST panel a bit earlier about the opportunity cost for users, especially holders of LSTs in DeFi, that kind of dissonance between the opportunity cost of LST holders and the ability to kind of deposit in EigenLayer is something that we haven't necessarily kind of set as a sure fact that we're going to be able to kind of mitigate that cost. And even with the kind of creation of things like liquid restaking providers, which are essentially kind of strategy managers that mint a liquid representation of EigenLayer positions, you kind of can run into similar centralization problems that you might have with certain providers, where things such as second-order effects with network effects with liquidity and other kind of more softer like lobbying effects can enable providers or liquid restaking providers to have a large control over EigenLayer stake, which may or may not be a good thing, but in general, we do want to promote decentralization within this ecosystem. So when we think about that and we think about, okay, we need to be able to kind of scale adoption and minimize the opportunity cost for users to enter into the system, the current paradigm doesn't really kind of work super effectively for that. Building trustless and secure AVSs does not necessarily translate or communicate to restakers direct value capture. Now, it may generate second-order effects of trust and safety. However, at the end of the day, restakers aren't going to necessarily walk onto the platform and understand immediately, okay, I understand that this system or this slashing mechanism is more secure, so I understand that this is going to lead to more revenue for me. And so the future that we kind of need to focus on is answering the question of how do we think about risk underwriting from an AVS native perspective and generally an infrastructure native perspective, and how can we actually communicate and translate that value to users via financial primitives. And so in trying to answer that question, kind of we generated an approach which focuses on kind of a balance between two things. One, building a scalable standard that's primarily trustless and automated, which for us was the solution we found in ZK Systems to analyze the risks within hardware dependencies in both AVSs and validators, and then to kind of like dog food that standard with building a primitive and financial products that users can actually kind of look towards that incentivize kind of capital allocation to more secure systems. So let's talk a little bit first about kind of what do we mean by these like ZK systems, ZK primitives. And so I'm going to share a little bit of a sneak peek of some information we're actually going to be coming out with later this week and next week, which is about enabling a trustless and automated consensus layer data pipeline via ZK state proofs and ZKML. So one of the kind of things we're working on internally is actually leveraging ZKML to analyze historical consensus layer attestation data on Ethereum and generating risk profiles around validator subgroups that can then kind of detect the propensity of certain validator subgroups to be slashed based on their historical kind of data. Seeing that confusion matrix there, within about a sub 1% degree of error margin, we're able to determine most of the or pretty much all of the validators that were actually slashed in that 20 validator slashing about a couple weeks ago. And by utilizing this kind of data framework, we can ideally scalably address some of the concerns around how do we kind of intake AVS data and actually build hardware-based mechanisms of understanding what slashing risk might look like. Now, The data analysis is just one part of it, but data progeny is also a kind of big important step when it comes to building a trustless system. And so that's why we're working on building a scalable ZK state-proof system that takes in consensus layer state proofs at first with validators, and eventually this will move on to execution layer state proofs with AVSs that have on-chain attributable actions to actually detect the true solvency of various different assets posted as collateral within eigenlayers, so whether it's LSTs or restaking positions, LRTs, so on and so forth. And at the same time, build a kind of foundation to actually automate this data framework as kind of consensus layer state continues and execution layer state continues, to where we effectively can minimize the amount of intermediary dependencies when it comes to actually porting and analyzing this data over the long run. And so when it comes to actually building the product for this, we wanted to focus on something that really kind of solves the three main use cases in kind of any type of capital market. Kind of low-cost hedging, the ability to access leverage or the demand for leverage, and then finally the ability to kind of take the risk-adjusted or analyze the risk-adjusted underlying capital value of a position and use that somewhere else in the ecosystem. And so the idea is that this kind of framework for validator and AVS-based underwriting allows the ability within kind of our first product, which is going to be kind of a lending borrowing market, to address demand for capital efficiency for LRT providers and restakers at scale. To effectively answer the question of, it's not, let me deposit in eigenlayer or somewhere else, it's let me deposit in eigenlayer and do something else. Right? And this also decreases kind of second order effects of the needs for liquidity. So things such as like the network effects of pre-existing providers, like opening up the door to LRTs within their own systems, is kind of minimized in this idea of kind of pre-existing parties having the ability to attract liquidity on the basis of already having liquidity can be minimized. And we can create a little bit of a more level playing field for people to focus on the thing that matters. Building better infrastructure, leading to better economic outcomes. And so there are a couple of additional second order effects I think are pretty interesting to highlight. One is kind of the ability to align robust AVS design with this ability of economic outcomes for restakers, because when you are able to literally financially incentivize users, your users, by developing more robust slashing mechanisms, by developing more robust AVSs, you can create an ecosystem where that is the main priority of translating value through building better infrastructure. And that's something that, as a whole, can kind of bolster the security of eigenlayer, hopefully at scale. The second thing is, with the growth and the kind of emergence of LRT providers, you can actually kind of align similar incentives with them, creating a way where they can have kind of a standard to follow when it comes to understanding, all right, if I want to provide my users access to capital efficiency, there's this push and pull between supporting AVSs at like completely at scale with the spread of the entire network, or creating kind of like smaller subsections of AVS delegations that I want to prioritize to understand that risk-reward framework. You can kind of create a community of folks who are more focused on being able to manage that risk by being able to build that standard and build the ability to monetize that standard for risk as well. The final thing is kind of reducing the risk associated with traditional price-based risk underwriting. I mean, in DeFi, people have been working on this since the progeny of DeFi, trying to figure out how to underwrite long-tail assets with low liquidity. It's something we still work on to this day, and we probably will never stop working on. And to kind of be able to kind of take a step back and say, let's, instead of focusing on this traditional methodology of underwriting risk via, counterparty liquidity and the secondary dependence on secondary markets, let's instead focus on the true underlying solvency of these assets and thinking about, okay, how can we actually align these infrastructure providers in building the better outcomes for these users outside of the dependency on needing to do things like governance lobbying or doing things like utilizing underlying like AVS incentives to bootstrap liquidity. Well, we can create ideally an ecosystem of AVSs that can focus on what matters, which is building those robust systems which provide that value to eigenlayer and by proxy restakers. And so kind of we're all here today, I'm sure, because we agree that, to some extent, that the commodification of security via the use of eigenlayer in the form of actually pricing that security in AVS revenue is something that we agree is inevitable. But I think the main question here is how we rethink DeFi, how we rethink risk underwriting, how we rethink how to align the incentives between infrastructure providers and those who are actually being the users of EigenLayer and providing that capital to EigenLayer will determine for how many that this is the truth. If anyone wants to chat more about any of the things I talked about, feel free to ping me.